April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. Adolf Hitler is dead. The camps are liberated. And in the stunned silence that follows, the world begins to ask a chilling question. Who will answer for the crimes? Among those led away in handcuffs were women, young, uniformed, once feared inside the barbed wire of Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen. Some had been secretaries, some had been nurses, others became guards, accused of brutality against prisoners whose only crime was existing. Names like Irma Grace would soon appear in headlines across Europe. In December 1945, after the Belsen trial conducted by British military courts, several of these women were sentenced to death. At just 22 years old, Grace walked to the gallows at Hamelin Prison, one of the youngest women executed under British law in the 20th century. This is not just a story of punishment. It is a story of reckoning when the victors of war turned to the courtroom and history demanded accountability. When Allied soldiers broke through the gates of Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April 1945, they expected horror, and they found it. Tens of thousands of unburied corpses, skeletal survivors barely clinging to life, and the stench of death so overwhelming that hardened soldiers wept openly. British Lieutenant Derrick Sington, one of the first officers to enter the camp, later described the scene as a gruesome sight beyond all imagination, recounting how walking through the camp felt like descending into a vision of hell that no briefing could have prepared him for. BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby, who accompanied the liberating forces, recorded a dispatch so harrowing that the BBC initially hesitated to broadcast it, fearing listeners would not believe it was true. Dimbleby reportedly broke down and wept during his recording. But among the images that shocked the world most profoundly were the women in uniform standing among the carnage, not as victims, but as perpetrators. Photographs taken in the days after liberation show female guards being forced to help bury the dead in mass graves, their faces caught in expressions ranging from defiance to blank indifference. These were the Aufseherinnen, the female overseers of the Nazi camp system, and their story challenges some of the deepest assumptions we hold about gender, complicity, and the capacity for human cruelty. To understand how ordinary German women ended up presiding over some of the worst atrocities in human history, one must first understand the peculiar position they occupied within the Nazi hierarchy. Women were never admitted as full members of the SS. Heinrich Himmler's feared organization was, in its formal structure, an exclusively male institution. Himmler himself held deeply traditional views about the role of women, believing their primary duty was motherhood in service to the Reich. Yet the sprawling network of concentration and extermination camps that the SS administered required more personnel than its male ranks could supply, particularly as the war dragged on after 1942 and more men were pulled to the front lines. The solution was the creation of a female auxiliary, the SS Gefolge, from which the Aufseherinnen were drawn. Over the course of the war, approximately 3,500 women served in this capacity, a number that is often surprising to those who imagine the camp system as an exclusively male operation. These women held no official SS rank, yet they wielded enormous power over the prisoners in their charge. They were assigned to camps across the Reich and occupied territories, with significant numbers serving at Ravensbrück, the primary women's concentration camp located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin in the forests of Brandenburg, as well as Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland, Bergen-Belsen in Lower Saxony, Majdanek on the outskirts of Lublin, and the Stutthof camp near Danzig on the Baltic coast. Smaller numbers served at dozens of subcamps and satellite facilities scattered across Nazi-controlled Europe, from the factories of the Flossenburg system to the labor installations attached to Neuengamme near Hamburg. The women who filled these roles were not, for the most part, drawn from the fanatical, ideological elite of the Nazi Party. Historical research into their backgrounds, most notably the work of historian Wendy Lower, whose 2013 book, Hitler's Furies, brought renewed scholarly attention to the subject, reveals a far more unsettling picture. They were remarkably ordinary. The majority came from working-class or lower-middle-class families. They were factory workers, domestic servants, shop assistants, hairdressers, and office clerks. Their ages ranged broadly, from women in their early 20s to those approaching 40. Many were recruited through regional labor offices, the same bureaucratic apparatus that assigned women to munitions, factories, or agricultural work, and some were effectively conscripted, as the war economy demanded ever more labor. The appeal was straightforward and material. The position of camp overseer offered wages significantly higher than most jobs available to women of their social standing. A female guard could earn over 185 Reichsmarks per month, roughly comparable to a skilled male industrial worker, at a time when a female factory worker might earn less than half that amount. Along with the salary came something perhaps even more enticing in the rigidly hierarchical society of Nazi Germany: authority and social mobility. For women who had spent their lives at the bottom of economic and social hierarchies, scrubbing floors or standing behind shop counters, the chance to wear a uniform, carry authority, and exercise absolute dominion over other human beings proved a powerful lure. The Nazi regime understood this calculus perfectly and exploited it. The story of Irma Gresser illustrates the pattern vividly. Born in 1923 to a dairy farming family in Recken-Mecklenburg, she had dreamed of becoming a nurse, but was rejected. She drifted through low-wage agricultural and dairy work before volunteering for camp service at the age of 18, a decision that would transform an unremarkable young woman into one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust. Once recruited, these women were funneled through a training process centered at Ravensbrück, which functioned as the primary finishing school for female overseers. The camp had been established in 1939 specifically as the main women's concentration camp, and by 1942, it was simultaneously serving as both a site of imprisonment and a training ground for the guards, who would staff the expanding camp system. The training was relatively brief, often just a few weeks, sometimes as little as 2, but it was intensive in its ideological content. Recruits were steeped in Nazi racial theory, taught to see the prisoners under their supervision not as human beings but as subhuman enemies of the Reich who deserved neither compassion nor basic dignity. They were trained in the methods of camp discipline, which in practice meant they were taught to be brutal. Instructors, some of them experienced guards like Dorothea Binz, who had served at Ravensbrück since its opening and was known for her casual, almost recreational violence toward prisoners, encouraged harshness and punished any sign of sympathy toward inmates. Binz, who was only 21 when she began her camp career, they would eventually rise to become the deputy chief wardress at Ravensbrück, and was described by survivors as taking visible pleasure in administering punishments, including floggings she carried out personally. The women who emerged from Ravensbrück's training program had been given both permission and incentive to treat prisoners with a degree of cruelty that would have been unimaginable in their previous civilian lives. The system was deliberately designed to erode moral boundaries through ideology, through peer pressure, through the intoxicating experience of unchecked power, and for many of these women, it worked with devastating efficiency. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt would later observe in a different but related context, the most disturbing thing about evil is not its demonic grandeur, but its terrifying ordinariness, what she famously called the banality of evil. The crimes committed by the Aufseherinnen across the camp system were extensive and well documented, thanks largely to the testimony of survivors who endured their rule. Common accusations that surfaced repeatedly during post-war investigations and trials included savage beatings, often with whips, riding crops, rubber truncheons, or wooden clubs administered for the most trivial infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all. Guards imposed starvation as punishment, withheld medical care from the desperately ill, forced prisoners to stand for hours during roll calls in freezing weather, and in the extermination camps, actively participated in the selection process that sent prisoners to the gas chambers. Survivors testified to arbitrary executions, to the abuse and murder of children, and to the use of attack dogs set upon defenseless inmates as a form of sadistic entertainment. Herta Both, a guard at both Stutthof and Bergen-Belsen, who became known among prisoners as the sadist of Stutthof, was described by survivors as beating women on forced marches with such ferocity that those who fell were left to die where they dropped. Ruth Neudeck, another Stutthof guard, was accused of selecting weak and ill prisoners for the gas chamber and of personally drowning women in the camp's nearby lake. Several individual guards became notorious for the extremity of their cruelty, their names seared into historical memory by the sheer volume of survivor testimony against them. Irma Grace, who served at both Ravensbrück and Auschwitz-Birkenau before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen in the final months of the war, was only in her early 20s during her time as a guard. Yet survivors described her as one of the most feared figures in the entire camp system. She was accused of beating prisoners with a plaited cellophane whip she carried constantly, of setting her trained dog on inmates, of conducting arbitrary shootings, and of personally selecting women for the gas chambers at Auschwitz with what witnesses described as visible enjoyment. Survivor Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist who was imprisoned at Auschwitz, recalled Grace's presence during selections and described her habit of kicking pregnant women in the abdomen. Olga Lengel, another Auschwitz survivor, wrote of Grace in her memoir 5 Chimneys as a figure who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the suffering she inflicted. Elisabeth Volkenrath, who served as head wardress at Bergen-Belsen, was accused of similar acts of violence and direct involvement in selections at Auschwitz. Where she had previously been stationed, survivors testified that she had personally sent women to the gas chambers and beaten prisoners who moved too slowly during roll call. Juana Bormann, an older guard in her 40s, who had served in several camps over the course of the war, including Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, was particularly associated with the use of dogs against prisoners. She was known to release her German Shepherd on inmates, and the terror this tactic instilled left survivors traumatized for decades. At her trial, witnesses described how Bormann's dog had mauled prisoners to death while she watched. Maria Mandel, who held the powerful position of head of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau from October 1942 to November 1944, was accused of bearing direct responsibility for the deaths of an estimated 500,000 women and children. In a chilling paradox that captures the surreal moral landscape of the camps, Mandel was also the driving force behind the creation of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, personally selecting which pieces the imprisoned musicians would play as columns of new arrivals were marched past some of them toward the gas chambers. She was said to have had favorite prisoners whom she protected one day and sent to their deaths the next, depending on her mood. And then there was Ilse Koch, the wife of Karl Otto Koch, commandant of Buchenwald, whose cruelty was so extreme and so widely reported that she became known in the press as the Witch of Buchenwald and the Beast of Buchenwald. Koch was accused of collecting tattooed skin from murdered prisoners as souvenirs, an allegation that became one of the most sensational and debated claims of the post-war trials. Though some of the more extreme accusations against her remain historically contested, her brutality toward prisoners was extensively corroborated. Her legal journey would follow a tortuous path. Sentenced to life imprisonment by an American military tribunal in 1947, her sentence was controversially reduced. Then she was rearrested and tried again by a West German court in 1951, receiving another life sentence. She took her own life in Eichach Women's Prison in Bavaria in 1967, never having expressed remorse. It is important to note, as historians have repeatedly emphasized, that not all female guards were equally sadistic. Some performed their duties with relative restraint. A very small number even showed occasional acts of covert kindness toward prisoners, slipping extra bread into a barrack or looking away during minor rule infractions. But complicity operated on a spectrum. Even those guards who did not personally beat or kill prisoners were functioning parts of a machinery of genocide. Their presence, their enforcement of camp rules, their participation in roll calls and labor assignments, and their silence made the system work. As the Italian writer and Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi reflected in his masterwork, The Drowned and the Saved, The camp system depended on a vast grey zone of collaboration and graduated responsibility that made simple moral judgments almost impossible. The question of where complicity ends and active perpetration begins would become one of the central dilemmas of the post-war trials. The end came with terrifying swiftness in the spring of 1945. As Allied forces advanced from both east and west, the camp system began to collapse. Himmler, in a frantic and contradictory series of orders, alternately commanded the destruction of evidence and the preservation of camps as bargaining chips for potential negotiations with the Western Allies. Some camps were hastily evacuated, their prisoners forced on death marches that claimed tens of thousands of additional lives in the war's final weeks. Others were simply abandoned as guards fled. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April 1945, and Soviet forces reached Auschwitz on January 27 and Majdanek even earlier in July 1944, the full scale of what had occurred became undeniable. Survivors, many barely alive at Bergen-Belsen, an estimated 13,000 unburied corpses lay across the campgrounds, and another 10,000 survivors would die in the weeks following liberation, despite Allied medical efforts began to give testimony. They identified guards. They named names. They described what had been done to them in meticulous, harrowing detail. Meanwhile, many of the Aufseherinnen attempted to disappear. Some shed their uniforms and tried to blend into the vast columns of refugees streaming across a shattered Germany. Others destroyed documents, burned identifying papers, and assumed false identities. Hermin Braunsteiner, a guard at Ravensbrück and later at Majdanek, where she earned the nickname the Stomping Ma, for her practice of stomping prisoners to death with her steel-tipped boots, managed to flee to Austria, later emigrated to Canada, and eventually settled in the United States, living as a quiet housewife in Maspeth, Queens, New York, for over a decade before Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal tracked her down in 1964. Her case would not be resolved until 1981, when she was extradited to West Germany and sentenced to life imprisonment by a Düsseldorf court. Some guards succeeded in vanishing permanently into the chaos of post-war Europe, but many did not. Allied soldiers, armed with physical descriptions and the testimony of survivors who recognized their tormentors, sometimes picking them out from crowds of refugees or identifying them in holding camps, arrested significant numbers of female guards in the weeks and months following liberation. The legal machinery that would process these arrests was still being assembled amid the rubble of a destroyed continent. The most famous post-war judicial undertaking, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which opened on the 20th of November, 1945, focused on the senior architects of Nazi policy men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer. The female camp guards fell below this level of prosecution, but they were far from forgotten. Instead, they were tried through a patchwork of legal proceedings that reflected the complex geopolitics of the post-war moment. British military courts, operating under a royal warrant issued by King George VI, tried guards captured in the British zone of occupation. Polish courts, operating under their own national legal authority and with particular urgency given that the worst extermination camps had operated on Polish soil, prosecuted guards who had committed crimes within Poland's borders. American military tribunals handled cases in their own zone under the authority of Control Council Law No. 10. The charges brought against these women were grave: war crimes, crimes against humanity, participation in murder, and systematic abuse and torture of prisoners. Prosecuting these cases presented significant challenges that tested the limits of existing legal frameworks. The Nazis had been meticulous record keepers in some respects. The bureaucratic documentation of the Holocaust fills entire archives, but they had also destroyed vast quantities of incriminating material as the regime collapsed. SS officers had burned personnel files, transport lists, and camp records in bonfires that raged across Germany in the final days of the war. Physical evidence was often fragmentary. The prosecution relied heavily on survivor testimony, which was powerful and often overwhelming in its cumulative effect, but carried its own legal complexities. Witnesses were traumatized. Memories were sometimes imprecise about specific dates and individual incidents. After years of sustained horror, and defense attorneys challenged their reliability aggressively, perhaps the most common defense argument mounted on behalf of the accused guards was the claim that they had merely been following orders, the so-called befehlsnotstand defense, that they were small cogs in an enormous machine and bore no individual responsibility for its outcomes. "I was just doing my duty," one Bormann reportedly told interrogators, a phrase echoed by defendant after defendant across the post-war trials. This defense, which mirrored arguments made at Nuremberg itself, was largely rejected by the courts. The principle that obeying manifestly illegal orders does not absolve an individual of criminal responsibility became one of the enduring legal legacies of the post-war trials and remains a cornerstone of international humanitarian law to this day, codified in the statutes of the International Criminal Court, established in 2002. The most prominent of the trials involving female guards was the Belsen trial, officially known as the trial of Josef Kramer and 44 others, which opened in a converted gymnasium in Lüneburg, Germany. On the 17th of September, 1945, barely 5 months after liberation, the choice of Lüneburg, a largely undamaged medieval town just south of Hamburg, was practical rather than symbolic. But the contrast between the picturesque town and the horrors described in the courtroom was stark. Conducted by a British military court presided over by Major General HMP Bernie Ficklin, the trial placed some of the most infamous names from the camp system in the dock. Irma Greyes, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Juana Bormann all stood accused of responsibility for atrocities committed at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Josef Kramer, the commandant of Bergen-Belsen, known to the press as the Beast of Belsen, sat among them. The trial lasted nearly 2 months, was covered extensively by international media, and the testimony presented was devastating. Survivor after survivor took the stand to describe the acts they had witnessed and endured. British prosecutor Colonel T.M. Backhouse presented a methodical case that connected the defendants' individual actions to the broader machinery of mass murder. The defense team, which included Major L.S.W. Cranfield representing Grace, argued that their clients had operated within a system that left them no meaningful choice, but the weight of testimony was overwhelming. On the 17th of November, 1945, the court delivered its verdicts. Gress, Volkenrath, Bormann, and 8 others, including Kramer, were sentenced to death. 14 defendants were acquitted. The executions were carried out on the morning of the 13th of December, 1945, at Hameln Prison, the same town associated with the medieval legend of the Pied Piper, a coincidence that did not escape contemporary commentators by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who was regarded as the most experienced hangman in Britain. Pierrepoint later wrote in his autobiography, Executioner, Pierrepoint, that he executed 13 people that day in rapid succession, describing it as the most demanding day of his professional life. He recalled that Irma Greyes was just 22 years old at the time of her hanging, making her one of the youngest women executed under British jurisdiction in the 20th century. According to Pierrepoint's account, Gress walked to the gallows calmly, without a tremor, and her final word was a single, quiet, schnell, quickly. He later reflected that in the moment of execution, every person he had ever hanged was simply a human being facing death, regardless of what they had done. Juana Bormann, by contrast, was described as having to be physically supported as she was led to the scaffold. The Ravensbrück trials, conducted by British authorities in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948 across 7 separate proceedings, cast the net wider. Multiple cases addressed crimes committed at the women's camp, and several female guards received death sentences, including Dorothea Binns, the former deputy chief wardress who had been instrumental in training new recruits in brutality. Binns was executed on the 2nd of May 1947 at Hameln Prison. Others were imprisoned for life or given lengthy prison terms. Carmen Maury, a particularly complex figure who had served as both a prisoner and a block elder, a prisoner functionary at Ravensbrück, and was accused of betraying fellow inmates to the SS, was sentenced to death, but took her own life in her cell before the sentence could be carried out. Separately, Maria Mandel, who had evaded capture longer than many of her colleagues by hiding in the Austrian countryside under a false name, it was eventually arrested by American forces in August 1945 and handed over to Polish authorities. She was tried by a Polish court in Kraków alongside other Auschwitz personnel. Found guilty of the crimes she had committed as head of the women's camp at Auschwitz, she was hanged on the 24th of January 1948 at the Montelupich prison in Kraków. In Poland, the Stutthof trials resulted in further convictions and executions of female guards, some of which were carried out publicly in 1946 before large crowds on the hills of Biskupia Górka near Gdańsk. Among the most remembered of those executed was Jenny Wanda Bachmann, a young guard who had been convicted of cruelties at Stutthof. According to widely circulated accounts, when asked before her trial whether she had anything to say, Bachmann reportedly stated, "Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short." She was hanged publicly alongside 10 other convicted war criminals on the 4th of July, 1946, before thousands of spectators. The public nature of these executions reflected the different legal and political climate in Poland, where the camps had operated on national soil, where millions of Polish citizens had been murdered, and where public demand for visible, unambiguous justice was intense and deeply felt. The manner in which these executions were carried out followed a broadly consistent pattern across the different jurisdictions. Death was administered by hanging, typically the long drop method, designed to cause rapid death through fracture of the cervical vertebrae, performed by official military or state executioners. The condemned were typically dressed in prison uniforms or plain clothing, their hands bound, and they were hooded with a white cloth bag before the moment of execution. The proceedings were witnessed by a small group of officials, military officers, legal representatives, a physician to confirm death, and a chaplain who offered final prayers, and in some cases, members of the press were permitted to observe. Public reaction varied significantly depending on geography and proximity to the crimes. In Britain, the executions at Hameln were reported extensively in newspapers like the Daily Express and the Daily Mirror, and while there was broad support for the verdicts, some voices raised concerns about the application of capital punishment, particularly to young women. Gresse's youth and physical appearance had made her a figure of particular fascination and discomfort in the British press throughout the trial. In Poland, where the wounds of occupation were raw and immediate, the public executions of camp personnel at Biskupia, Górka and elsewhere were met with overwhelming approval by large segments of the population who had lived under the terror these individuals helped enforce. The broader debate about whether capital punishment was an appropriate response to crimes of this magnitude, or whether any judicial punishment could truly be proportional to genocide, was one that would echo through the decades that followed and continues to inform debates about international criminal justice. The historical legacy of the Aufseherinnen trials remains contested in ways that reveal uncomfortable truths about gender, justice, and memory. A significant body of historical scholarship has examined whether these women were judged more harshly, both by the courts and by public opinion, precisely because they were women. The brutality of male guards and commandants was in some sense expected within the framework of war and masculine violence, but the image of women committing acts of extreme cruelty against other women and against children violated deeply held assumptions about femininity, maternal instinct, and the supposedly gentler nature of womanhood. The media of the time leaned heavily into this dissonance, portraying figures like Grace and Koch as monstrous aberrations, beasts, witches, and she-wolves who had abandoned their womanhood. The British tabloid press was particularly fixated on Grace's appearance. She was young and blonde, and the incongruity between her looks and her crimes generated a kind of horrified fascination that male defendants simply did not provoke in the same way. Wendy Lower has argued in Hitler's Furies that this gendered framing actually served to obscure the systemic nature of the crimes by treating these women as uniquely deviant, as aberrations of nature, The society could avoid reckoning with the far more disturbing reality that ordinary people, given power, ideological permission, and an environment that normalized violence, are capable of extraordinary evil, regardless of gender. The Aufseherinnen were not monsters who had somehow infiltrated the human race. They were products of a specific historical system that identified their capacity for cruelty and cultivated it, just as it had done with hundreds of thousands of men. The following order's defense, though rejected at the time, has continued to generate debate among legal scholars, historians, and psychologists. The post-war courts established a clear precedent. Individual responsibility cannot be dissolved by institutional authority. Yet the question of how much genuine choice these women had recruited through labor offices, trained in an environment that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, operating within a totalitarian system that brooked no dissent, and where refusal to carry out orders could theoretically result in punishment, remains a subject of serious historical inquiry. It is worth noting that historians have found little evidence that any guard, male or female, was ever executed or even severely punished for refusing to participate in atrocities, a fact that undermines the "I had no choice" defense considerably. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted his famous obedience experiments at Yale University, demonstrating that ordinary Americans could be induced to administer what they believed were dangerous electrical shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. Milgram himself explicitly connected his findings to the behavior of perpetrators during the Holocaust, writing, "The social psychology of this century reveals a major lesson. Often, it is not so much the kind of person a man is, as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act." This is not to excuse the actions of the Aufseherinnen. The courtroom testimony of their victims forecloses any such possibility, but to understand the mechanisms by which a modern state can transform ordinary citizens into instruments of genocide, and to recognize that those mechanisms remain present in every society. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire story is the unevenness of the justice that was delivered. While the women who stood trial and faced execution became public symbols of Nazi guilt, their photographs published around the world, their names synonymous with female cruelty, they represented only a fraction of the approximately 3,500 women who served as Aufseherinnen across the camp system. The vast majority were never prosecuted. They returned to civilian life in post-war Germany, quietly resumed ordinary existences, raised families, held jobs, and grew old in anonymity. Some were eventually identified and tried decades later. Hermann Braunsteiner, the stomping mayor of Majdanek, was not extradited from the United States until 1973 and not sentenced until 1981. Hildegard Leckert, who had served at both Ravensbrück and Majdanek and was known to prisoners as Bloody Brigitte for her extraordinary violence, was similarly not sentenced until the Majdanek trial in Dusseldorf in 1981, where she received a 12-year prison term more than 35 years after her crimes. But most of the 3,500 were never held to account at all. The Cold War shifted political priorities almost immediately, as the Western Allies came to view a stable, rearmed West Germany as essential to containing Soviet expansion. Denazification programs were scaled back, amnesties were granted, and West German society proved largely unwilling to pursue former camp personnel with any sustained vigor. A collective silence that the German Jewish philosopher Theodor Adorno would describe as a failure not just of justice, but of the entire culture. The women who were executed at Hameln, at Montelupich prison in Krakow, and on the windswept hills of Biskupia Gorka thus bore a disproportionate share of a collective reckoning that never fully took place. Symbols of justice in a landscape marked far more broadly by its conspicuous and deliberate absence. When the gates of the camps were thrown open in 1945, the world saw horrors it could barely comprehend. Among those led into courtrooms were women who had once worn the uniform of the Reich Guards from places like Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, now standing before military tribunals. Some, like Irma Grace, were only in their early 20s when they were sentenced to death and executed in December 1945. Their trials were swift, their names etched into the darker margins of history. Justice, many believed, had to be visible. As the philosopher George Santayana warned, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The executions of Hitler's female guards were not just punishments, they were statements. A message that cruelty, no matter who carries it out, answers to history in the end. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, even in the ruins of war, accountability leaves the final mark.